going to give you a little, overview of what I'd like to cover, but also keeping in mind what you've all just shared. And I wanted to start by just introducing a little bit about how I got interested in making radio stations, and then give a couple of examples of different artists and cultural workers who have the kinds of radio stations they've created, and then kind of generalizing different parameters and choices, that the radio station is not a fixed form, but that we can cook it in different ways, different ingredients that we can add depending on what space we want to make. If there's time, I will talk a little bit about a station that I've been part of creating in Bergen, Norway, and is now kind of a mobile nomadic station. And then if people are interested, I can also share specific examples of working with educational settings where we've made radios and also designed them. I used to teach at a college in Vermont called Goddard College, which was an experimental college that sadly closed a couple of years ago. Really was a rich place to be a teacher, and I feel like I learned so much there. But the school, which is more common in the US than other parts of the world, had a radio station. University and community radio stations these infrastructures are different in different continents and regions of the world. But Goddard had a radio station. And I initially got interested in, students not just doing their work for me, but doing, what if they really thought about the audiences that their work, all this wonderful learning that they're doing, could speak to? Why does the learning that we do have to stick into the enclosure of the school? So initially I was bringing them into the station and they had to present their final thesis projects on air. So again, to think about the publics. And over time I got excited to help them, and in my own work as well, really think about the art of the audio work, so that they would actually make compositions, you could say. They could be stories, but we delved into the radio story as a form that you actually record and edit, and that's its own genre that I have a lot of affection for. But basically the art of storytelling with sound for the radio as a space. But then the more I was inhabiting radio stations, and maybe with a lot of you here, fell in love with the radio station as a space. There's this feeling, if you've been in a radio station, as soon as your show is done, another group is coming in and to share something that they're very passionate about. I was doing my own show, a series of 5 shows in Vienna at a free radio station, which is their version of a community radio station, called Radio Orange. And 24 hours a day, there are each 2 hours, a different demographic in the city had their own program. And it felt to me like the potential of this really exciting, almost utopia. Where else do we have an infrastructure that everyone claims in their own creative way? So I fell in love with the radio station as potential. It's potential because there were also limits to how the different groups were interacting with each other. But anyway, I was curious about just exploring this format of radio, how radio has been presented to us. Radio was invented as we know it to replace the telegraph, which was in the 1900s, and a lot of it is communication at a distance. It has a complex history related even to colonialism and being able to manage faraway areas from basically places in Europe. And so even as I mentioned before, the ideas of what communication is, that many of us in the West especially assume that communication is a signal that has been received. It even has radiophonic language. But of course, communication is far more complex and nuanced, and transmission is even a very complex term. What is communication? is communication always what we want? Is miscommunication also a kind of, what are the potentials in miscommunication, in static and interference? And but so I was curious about how might we challenge some of these assumptions, or even just question what is already embedded in this technology, the sender separate from a receiver. And one early questioning came from Bertolt Brecht, just, within the first 10 years of radio invention. He was saying, why do we have radio just be like a one-sided apparatus? What would happen if we actually had this mass communication platform that was two-way? And even then they had the telephone, which of course is a two-way, but it's not necessarily a mass communication, it's private. So even just this kind of questioning, and he came up with this term, the transceiver, which I think is very poetic. And there's a lot of ripples of that. And again, but it's just starts to jam, to use a radio term, to jam the idea that the sender is separate from the receiver, and unexamined assumptions about communication. As part of my early inquiry into questioning the radio, ways of working with radio, I learned about the first radio station, which happened to be in the city where I was born and raised, and the station is still existing. But just to kind of give a year to it, we're talking just 100 years ago, the first radio station. And just to kind of play again, like slow down the concept and to see what openings might emerge, to see how this might relate to some of your interests. The radio station has kind of two directions, you could say. One is this idea of like movement out. The radio is radiant, radiating, radial. And then the station is like a very different direction. It's a kind of rooting down. The radio heads out, the station goes down. So even here, there's kind of two movements. And when I was starting to question the radio station, it was right in the early days of COVID. And I was doing a lot of yoga to kind of take care. And I had a wonderful yoga teacher who was talking even within the postures of yoga. Like, what does it mean to go in two directions at once, to reach up and to root down? And so even on a physical level, I think it's quite a powerful way to position a body in two directions, and the kind of stability and the way these two directions can serve each other. If some of you are thinking about radio stations or intrigued by radio stations, a lot of you have mentioned specific ones in specific locations, not just internet. It does a lot to have a physical space, a gathering that can kind of allow some kind of a commitment, relationships to form. And but at the same time, there's something about radio, and Alessandra actually referred to this, kind of this idea that you're also speaking. It's a very particular form of being together, because we don't have sight in most radio stations. We're really just listening to the voice. And we also don't know who's listening. Some internet infrastructures you can actually track very carefully, but in FM and AM or shortwave, you have no idea how many people are listening or who's listening, which is very exciting. Not just because you don't know who on a practical level, but it does something also energetically. It changes a conversation. Like right now, we're in a closed space. We know everyone who's entering. This is a different space than the mystery that opens with radio. Radio, unlike a closed circle, it's always an open circle. Which does something to our presence and to even who we become in that space, I believe. So I find these kinds of paying attention to these things really adds a level of mystery and poetry to the radio station as a form. Just to bring in someone who's inspired me. This is an essay that I will skip over, but it's just to kind of mention it. The source is right here, La Prieta by Gloria Anzaldúa, who also talks about these two directions that I was just mentioning. She talks about, rather than kind of radiating out and rooting down, she talks about going into the self and out into the world, the path of a two-way movement, and kind of recreating the self and recreating society. So I offer these to kind of sprinkle this more philosophy of how I approach the radio station and its potential for these two directions, to kind of be part of jamming the history of radio and this kind of maybe simple story that radio is about sending, and instead thinking through these multiple directions that radio is affecting us, and can then help us also open up to the mysteries and layers of communication. I'll give a couple of examples now of people who have played with the form of the radio station, who have inspired me in thinking about this. Ricardo Zunig is a Brooklyn-based artist who was interested in playing with the form and made shopping carts. He's done this in Brooklyn and also took this project to Linz in Austria, and continues to do a lot of work around making communication forms in the street and accessible in public to people. So this was using a mini FM, an unlicensed transmitter, setting up radios, and I think also had an online, so multiple forms of scales. And I'll return to this idea of what spaces are you inhabiting when you make a radio station, and making choices about that. Another project that's been inspiring to me, these are in year chronology, is a Turkish collective that in 2005 did this project. It's a feminist collective, Oda Projesi. They inhabited an apartment in a neighborhood in Istanbul that was getting gentrified, and set up a radio station there, also an unlicensed mini FM. And if anyone's interested in this, I can geek out with you. It's very simple tech. I'm not a techie person, but it's very easy tech to get access to and to use. And they set up conversations in this housing area, questioning gentrification. So they had a month-long series of conversations inhabiting the space in a neighborhood with other inhabitants, and having kind of using the radio space as, again, kind of an elevated conversation. And I will return to, again, the mini FM is something that I think is very exciting. This is a weak signal. This is a signal that doesn't go that far, but does still something to the kinds of conversations that happen, and bring in that mystery of who else might be listening. This is a project that Pan-African Space Station has its roots in South Africa, and has been inspiring to me also. They kind of affiliate themselves with the spirit of Sun Ra, and go all over, they're invited all over the world to set up usually week-long radio stations, specifically with the African diaspora in that city. They invite people, they inhabit often libraries or universities, and again, kind of activate, make visible and audible. They do internet radio stations, so they're also speaking to a global diaspora from African continent, and kind of cultivating community and bringing voices alive in these kind of curated weeks. So they last 1 week, but it's an ongoing, iterative, invited radio station. Here's a very different kind of radio station, which is also going, rather than on the internet, into a very small scale. And this is actually also a kind of tactical media. These are two artists. Ebru is Turkish, and Irene is, I'm not quite sure where she's from, I think Austria. They did this in Vienna where they worked with textiles and actually brought in a conductive thread into a sweater and hooked it up with a transmitter. So, and it was meant specifically, the idea emerged when there was a lot of protests happening in Istanbul in 2013. And the idea is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but also quite serious as an undetectable communication tool, where people would wear these sweaters and could communicate to each other different tactical information related to this protest, these ongoing protests in 2013. And but yeah, I think there's something incredibly clever and blurring kind of artistic medium. This is probably my favorite inspiration. Tetsuo Kogawa actually started Radio Home Run in Tokyo, and it lasted a really long time. In the interest of time, I won't play a short promotional video that they made in the 80s, but I'm happy to provide the link. And there's quite a lot written about this. Tetsuo Kogawa is himself, he's now a kind of an elder in radio art and radio mini FM especially. He did work, he kind of comes out of philosophy as well, and did work with Deleuze and other philosophers to think through the micropolitics of mini FM. Basically, they created using one of these 1 watt transmitters, which doesn't go that, it goes maybe, I think it went 1 city block in Tokyo. They inhabited a storefront, and this was open to everybody. The way he writes about it is really endearing to me, like just open to the misfits, open to the people who otherwise might not get to know each other in the neighborhood, in this neighborhood in Tokyo. And again, it had a long life, which is exciting. Some of his micro radio manifestos. So for those of you for whom licensing is not an option, mini FM is, depending on the strength of your signal, it could be illegal, and there are different things to think about. But it's also, there are some, depending on the size of the signal you use, you can actually also do it legally. And different countries have different ranges that are legal. I think in the US it's gotten quite rough, but technically this is a kind of pirate radio station, but it's just less detectable because it's a small range and doesn't interfere as widely because it's a small range. But again, the tenderness, this gets into some of the poetics and the poetry of this form, which I have fallen in love with, like thinking of radio itself as a tender, vulnerable. Someone mentioned this idea that FM radio signals are affected by mountains and cement and buildings. Of course, many people also set up radio stations these days that are simultaneously online and have your own transmitter so that you can have multiple scales. So someone had mentioned this idea of space. And again, I'm coming from an artist viewpoint, but I've also been a community organizer, so thinking of it both poetically but also strategically. These are some of the ingredients, the categories of decisions. Where might you place a station? Is it kind of hidden? Is it a storefront? It all depends on what access you have to resources. Are you sharing it with another organization? What is the scenography of the station? How are people positioned in relationship to each other? Is there a lot of gear? Is there very simple gear? You don't need, nothing is required. A radio station doesn't have to look one way. And if you want, I can also share with you some incredibly imaginative radio stations. I can just tell you quickly, I was teaching how to build a radio station, how to cook a radio station at an architecture school, an experimental architecture school in Bergen, Norway. And the first one that students built was actually just a plank with a hole in it where they put a bowl, and then the plank was roped together by 2 people. They had a little transmitter and they just walked with it. It was a mobile walking radio station. And the bowl had questions that they could engage people with. So you have questions about, does this radio station last forever? Does it last as long as there's interest? Does it last for a day? Does it last every full moon? How long does it go on air? Is it the length of a conversation? Is it, from 3 to 5 every Saturday? Who has access to the station? Who makes the decisions? Again, this idea of the medium and strength of transmission. Are you sending on AM, FM? Are you licensed or are you not? Are you also online? If you're online, are you on a proprietary online system? There are also really wonderful organizations like Wave Farm in upstate New York that no matter where you are is a really great resource for their transmission arts organization. And I think any of the projects that people have mentioned, they would be an interesting resource to look at. They have partner streams. So I will in a second tell you about Radio Multe, the station that I have been part of starting. And we are a partner stream to Wave Farm. So this is one way of doing online that doesn't have to be proprietary. You don't have to pay, or it's on a private group that you're a platform. And there are other examples too. There's a really wonderful group in Paris that you can do stuff with, although they're a little more technically complicated. Wave Farm makes it very easy. Then this idea of one to many, many to many, many to one goes back to these ideas of Bertolt Brecht. Is it one radio, like is the sender sending out, is the radio station conceived of a space where there's a sender sending out a signal? Or what I love about the Tetsuo Kogawa situation that has been so inspiring to me, even when not working with just a mini FM, is this idea of bringing everyone into the station. So maybe I will talk about that. This idea that the station becomes a community center. People who might not think that they're going to go on air, if they come every week, suddenly they become part of the sending group as well. I have found that very wonderful. To blur the lines between sender, receiver, audience, radio host. And then a couple of other things, like what is the mission of your station? I think that can be interesting. For the station that I will introduce in a second, Radio Multe, the concept and the mission has been every show that we do, that people propose, it has to in some way contribute to a living inquiry in what is communication and what is community. And those can be answered in the most weird and wild ways, but just somehow with that same question as a point of departure. And then do you archive? Is this live radio station, or are you also having an archive? There's a whole question there about what it means when you shift into the recorded world and this kind of huge boom of the podcast, which is essentially more recorded archives and the different infrastructure for people to access that. I'll just tell you quickly about Radio Multe, and I'm going to play a clip from it just to give you a sonic feel. And then I actually would love to hear from you. And so these are some images and from Radio Multe, which I was able to get funding from our city in Bergen, even though I don't live in Bergen anymore. I just moved from Bergen, Norway. But I'm going to take you to a catalog of images, and I'm going to share with you now this 1.5 minute sonic collage of our sounds.
Hello, and welcome to Radio Multe. Velkommen. Velkommen tilbake til Amorgeren på Radio Multe. That's strength. How can we generate that power to facilitate?
That's why we connected in this special way. lot of motivation. As Elizabeth, you know, because you were there, Spotterud is a ghetto. And not only it's a ghetto, it's a ghetto that is
og derav brukte vi den arenan för det var engagerande både när fargen, musik.
And I struggled a lot to find out who I was without, you know, serving people and taking care of people and sacrificing, giving up everything.
Masse multebær, søte multebær. Hele verden full av multebær.
Excluding deterritorialized quantum souls, a soul in a non-localized space-time, dismembered, dislocated from any locality and ground.
So that's a quick overview of the visuals and sounds of Radio Multe, which I can say a little bit more about if you want. Yeah, I actually think I'm gonna stop the presentation now, and I'd love to hear, you know, any questions or responses, just to hear from different voices, anything that comes up for you, and any questions I can assist with.
It would be great if you close the share, that way we can see each other.
Yeah, I agree.
Or we can create the radio dialogue.
Yeah, right.
Not seeing each other.
How do I stop sharing? Can you remind me how I stop
Just
sharing?
go above. Wait, I can stop it for you. 1 second.
Okay, thanks. Great. Yeah, so if there are any questions about anything technical, conceptual, how this might relate or resonate for you. Paula.
Yes, I was intrigued about the community project where you were discussing the group, the feminist group, and how that was. So maybe you could say a little bit more about that, if you wouldn't mind. Also, I've always been a fan of listening to Radio Garden. So, and I don't know if everybody is aware of it, but it's an app where you can basically pick a spot, a light spot around the globe, and listen into any radio station that happens to be playing at the time that you so desire. So radio.garden.
Yeah.
It's online as well as an app.
I don't have a whole lot more to say about Oda Projesi, but I would recommend looking them up. That's the Turkish group that you wanted to know more about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because actually it's I have not come across an archive of their work. I've just been so intrigued by the form of what they've done inhabiting. So I can share with you an article I know about, but I have not actually heard their work.
Sure, that would be great. I'd like to learn a little bit more, primarily because some of the work that I'd done in my life, and as well as sort of linked to a woman's circle that I've been part of for the better part of 30 years. It connects with the community in Peru, where I lived for many years, and so it's an interesting concept because there's ownership of radio equipment is severely limited. And so if there's a way of community involvement around something that might enable, communications, I would be interested in knowing more about it. I also happen to know that, is it Culture International? They often do have programs for putting together for indigenous communities radio stations, radio equipment. They often are part of it's part of their program, and they support indigenous radio around the world. So that's also been an interest of mine.
I would highly recommend people check out Wavefarm because they've just been also making packages to people to start their own work. So they've also been thinking about tech access. So Wavefarm is.
And how do they combat the mountain issue? Because in Peru, The Andes Mountains are a severe barrier to active radio, any type of telecommunication, internet. There are real barriers, physical barriers to communities being able to communicate even across the valley.
Yeah, no, it's a huge deal. I guess people deal with this by working with I mean, you also have to invest in different kind of strengths of signal that also have national regulation. You can only usually get a license for a certain, it really depends on the country. You can do different ways of relaying a signal. But these are kind of very techy things that have to do with very specific locations. But maybe,
Yes.
yeah. Theodora, I think you had your hand up.
Hi, yes. So I'm actually also working on a radio station that works by LoRa technology, like long range distance technology. And of course, you have to adjust the antennas per nation you are in. For example, Americas work on different frequencies than Europe, where I'm located right now. And I'm using Meshtastic for this because my whole point is to have this portable radio station that can be used in emergency situations or off grid.
Yeah.
And
this is super exciting.
This is really interesting. But every time I talk about this to some other techie person, they're like, why would you waste your time doing something like this? Instead, like your phone is basically better than a radio. Why would you? But at the same time, cellular towers don't work all the time, and sometimes places under occupation are struggling to keep up communication. And I think this could be an interesting thing. So I'm looking right now into all kinds of documentation about how to manage a radio station. And right now I'm still in the hardware zone.
Yeah.
But I like these kids from I don't remember which one, but they did some radio station with a ball and some thread, and you can probably develop many ways to do a radio station. You just have to have some kind of conductor and some type to like make the resonance. But yeah, if you have anything like any kind of documentation about how to literally step by step how to do this type of stuff.
Yeah, fantastic. Will you send me an email after? Because I would love to stay in touch with you. I really like what you're doing. Yeah, I mean, it also has so much to do with the scale of the signal, as you know, like Tetsuo Kogawa, who I mentioned. Are you familiar with him? Because he has all these fantastic, a whole history of do-it-yourself transmitters. So what city are you in?
Right now, I'm in Amsterdam, but I'm going to Romania and then to Portugal. So that's why I kind of wanted a portable thing so that I can have the range.
That's really cool. I know that there are a bunch of people in Berlin who are very excited in exploring similar things, and they do it also from a feminist perspective. So I just have to get a reminder on what the name of their organization. Maybe you've come across them, but yeah, I mean, there is this kind of group within radio stations that's specifically looking at resilience that I have a list of names that could be valuable to synergize with.
Yes, thank you so much.
Sure. Rachel.
I would love to just hear more about like the educational setting of I'm really curious about just like how radio can influence or twist time, like classroom time, or just like is there the possibility of like turning a class into a radio station or something along those lines of like allowing for that? Like it was so beautiful to hear the cacophony of voices and music and yeah, and what would that be like for students? And so I don't know if you can just talk more about like the educational context or the unlearning that can happen.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess there's at least two different contexts or more. One is the radio station itself as a learning, unlearning space, and then also schools, which are explicitly learning spaces, and how to set up radio stations there that can push or challenge or duplicate, reinforce what the goals of that space are too. I mean, I feel like the radio station, Radio Multe, that you just saw and heard quickly, people came every transmission. So it's almost as if we were like a learning group. And then people had programs, but this wonderful thing that happened in Radio Multe where people would step into other people's programs and always become interlocutors with each other. And then, so they would become, so we, again, like that blurring of these lines between sender, receiver, programmer, and guest, and host, and everything, blurring that. And and then we started to also experiment. One of the things, again, in the spirit of questioning communication, questioning community, that was, again, the mission of Radio Multe. We started to do scores for on-air communication. So we would creatively play with what it even means to go on air together and to talk together. So we would try out these different scores. And that is like maybe I was hoping to actually do a score with you all, but just a lot to cover. And and then I can just say quickly, teaching how to cook a radio station at this architecture school, and the students claimed it for themselves as a place where they wanted to just interview other students about their learning. So they took it on, and that was the mission for their station. Maybe a third example that might anticipate what Vishva is doing is in Seyðisfjörður, a small town in Iceland. There's a really wonderful community radio station, and they started a radio school where they teach radio on the radio. So there's also using radio as this kind of non-local, they were including both FM but also internet. So again, you're thinking about what spaces of the people that you're learning or unlearning together. Yeah, there's much more to say, but yeah, I mean, just opening up possibilities. Yeah. So Vishwa, you had a hand.
Yeah. So, what does an academic do? And because I have this understanding that things can go wrong. And then there's someone who has to figure out why they went wrong.
Do you mean technically something can go wrong on a radio station, or?
Culturally, engineering solution, no. But more the other angle. But that's not my question. My question is does the phenomena of being broadcasted, is it researched that if there is a broadcast station that opens up somewhere, what happens to the psyches of the people around you? What does a radio station do to, how do you evaluate, or how do you frame to gauge if the thing is creating positive or negative ripples?
Sure, yeah. If you want to send me an email later also, I can share with you some really big funded projects out of Amsterdam. It was and I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was a multidisciplinary look at the impact of radio stations. And this would be, I would say, maybe a social science exploration, because you'd have to maybe interview people. What is the impact? How do you define impact? Impact on the senders, impact on the listeners. so I haven't, you know, and I guess you'd have to think about why you would need that information, because maybe for funders to justify something that you're building. But I can just say anecdotally, it for myself, and I think you can talk to a lot of people personally, just to anyone who's part of a radio station can talk about their own experiences, what it has meant for them. I can say that being part of a radio station, it's been like making a family, you know, like and a very odd one, like a very diverse family, which is really, really fun. People of different ages, different language backgrounds, different racial, ethnicity, genders, and interests. I think that can be really exciting. I guess we have to start.
Yeah. Cliff has something to say. I will write back to you, but
okay.
I
look forward to that.
I'll just leave the word that I would like to speak about, which is reverse social media. Now, it's my poppy word for something else, which is a research methodology already, but I don't know how to. Yeah, let's leave it. I'll write back.
Right, and then I guess you point this issue around the media ecologies we live in, and where does radio fit in that? And that's a very important point. Like, you know, the whole spectrum of media that we consume and or contribute to. How are we positioned in that? Who owns that? And radio is definitely, and especially these kind of making your own stations, are situated within a larger media ecology.
Radio is cool.
Thank you, Vishwa. The question I had is, do you, or does Waveform perhaps even have any alternatives to the kind of traditional licensing that helps musicians get paid for the work that you would play?
Right.
You would program. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think each country has its own licensing, and I don't know that Wavefarm has an alternative. It's Wavefarm but I know that they pay the subscription to the firm. It's different from Spotify, and again, it's different in each country that I've been working in. You have different unions, but I don't think it's as bad as like the Spotify model. I think people actually, but I'm no expert on that, but I don't know that they have an alternative, but it's actually, I'm sure it's something they're thinking about. So it would be worth asking them. Maybe that's a good place to end this conversation. That was so fast, and I feel like we scratched the surface. I'd love to hear more about what you might cook up.
Can we go one step backwards and just talk about the ecology in which radio is being established, where I just said it was cool, but what you were starting to say about, can you just explore that for 5 minutes? That would be
the idea of a media ecology.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I think like if you think about in a day all the different media that you are using, or, you know, like, and what do we mean by media even, but like now we're using a Zoom way of interacting, and maybe you're listening to a podcast, maybe you're watching something streaming, all the different ways that we're kind of woven into, entangled with. I mean, what are the other media? I will probably call my mom tonight on the phone. That's another media. All of these massive infrastructures that we are syncing up with and inform how we communicate, and again, maybe what we think communication is. These are, you know, rarely spaces that are commons, you know, because they have been owned, even though there's really actually super interesting sovereignty claims over the electromagnetic spectrum by the Maori in you know, now New Zealand. That they've won a legal claim over that this is sovereign territory, the electromagnetic spectrum, and that they need to get compensated for use of this commons that most people in the West don't conceive of as a commons, the electromagnetic spectrum. So there's actually a lot of issues getting into private property and all the ways that links up with the media and the terms of engagement. Who's deciding, who's choosing them? So I don't know, that's one, scratching the surface of this idea of media ecologies that we're part of.